He poured the kerosene slow, like prayer. Then the knock came, 3 soft taps against the wind, and a voice like wet gravel. "Help!" The can was heavy in his hand, a cold metal anchor in the dim light of the single lantern. It glugged, a thick, syrupy sound that coated the floorboards, soaking into the wood he'd hewn himself 30 winters past. The smell was sharp, an acrid perfume of finality that clawed at the back of his throat, cleaner than the stench of rot and memory that clung to the cabin's every surface. Each slow, deliberate slosh was a sacrament. He was anointing the place, preparing it for its pyre. This wasn't just a cabin. It was a mausoleum he had built with his own 2 hands, and tonight he would be its last and only occupant. He started at the back wall, where the small, warped photograph of his wife, Alara, was tucked into a crack in the chinking. The kerosene darkened the pine around her faded smile, making the wood look bruised. Her eyes, even in the monochrome sepia, seemed to watch him, not with judgment, but with a weary understanding he had long since stopped deserving. He'd brought her here, to this harsh edge of the world, promising a life carved from untamed land. He'd given her a grave instead, dug in frozen earth while the wolves sang her eulogy. He splashed the fuel a little higher there, wanting the flames to take her image first, to free her from this prison of his grief. Next was the hearth, the stones cold and black. He doused the worn armchair beside it, the one where he'd sat night after night, cleaning his rifle until the blued steel gleamed under the moon, the repetition a mantra against the screaming ghosts in his head. The ghosts of the war, the ghosts of the famine that followed, the ghost of the son he'd never held. The kerosene soaked into the horsehair stuffing, the fabric turning a deep, wet black. He remembered the day he'd bought it, hauling it 10 miles on his back, a ridiculous luxury, because Alara had said she wanted a soft place to read. She'd never gotten the chance. The books he'd bought for her sat on a high shelf, their spines untouched, their pages still smelling of the print shop in a town that no longer existed. He sloshed the fuel up there, too, letting it drip down onto the mantelpiece, over the crude wooden bird he'd carved for their boy, a small, wingless thing. He worked his way through the single room, baptizing every object with the promise of oblivion. The rickety table where they'd eaten their meager meals, the bed frame he'd built, its ropes sagging, the straw mattress stained with sweat and sickness and solitude. He poured it over his tools, rusted from disuse, and over the stack of pelts in the corner, their value meaningless now. Each splash was a line in a long, silent goodbye. He was erasing the evidence of a life misspent, a testament to failure. The air grew thick, heavy with fumes that made his eyes water, or maybe it was something else. He didn't care to distinguish anymore. Grief and kerosene smelled the same tonight. He saved the doorway for last. He stood on the threshold, the open door letting in a slice of the bitter wind that howled through the pines. The forest was a vast, black ocean around his small island of regret. He emptied the last of the can onto the floor, the liquid pooling against the worn sill. There. It was done. The whole world he had made was now ready to be unmade. He set the can down with a dull thud, his movements deliberate, unhurried. There was no rush. He had waited a lifetime for this piece. He pulled a match from the small tin box in his coat pocket. The phosphorus tip was a tiny speck of red, a seed of fire. He looked around the room one last time, the lantern light catching the gleam of the kerosene, connecting every memory into a single, flammable web. He could feel the heat already, a phantom warmth against his skin. It would be quick. The whole structure would go up like a torch. He would stand in the center, and for one bright, searing moment, he would be free. No more memories, no more failures. Just light. And then, nothing. He was ready. He had been ready for years. He took a deep breath, the fumes a dizzying incense. He raised the match to the rough stone of the hearth. He felt the scrape, the friction. He was a breath away from the spark. Then the knock came. 3 soft taps against the wind, so faint he almost mistook it for a branch scratching against the outer wall, or the scuttling of some desperate creature in the eaves. But it was too rhythmic, too human. He froze, his hand hovering, the match head pressed against the stone. A bitter curse formed on his lips. Who, in the name of all the forgotten gods, would be out here? In this storm? Miles from any track, leagues from any settlement. No one came here. No one had come here in years. He was a ghost long before he'd decided to become ash. He waited, holding his breath, hoping the sound would fade, would prove to be a phantom of his fraying mind. Let them go away. Let them freeze. It wasn't his concern. His concerns were ending right here, right now. Then the voice. Help. It was thin, reedy, like wet gravel scraped across a stone. A child's voice shredded by cold and exhaustion. It barely pierced the howl of the wind, but it landed in the center of his chest like a thrown stone. Help. The word was an obscenity in this place, a language he no longer spoke. He hadn't helped anyone, not even himself, for a decade. He remained frozen, a statue of imminent self-destruction. Go away, he thought, a venomous, silent plea. Just go away and let me finish. The knock came again, weaker this time, more of a desperate scrabbling. It was followed by a sound that cut through his resolve far more effectively than any plea, a deep, wet, racking cough. A cough that ended in a choked gasp. Tarn Darrell growled, a low, animal sound of pure frustration. The timing was a cruel joke, a final twist of the knife from a universe that had always delighted in his torment. He couldn't. He couldn't just stand here and listen to a child die on his doorstep while he held the means of his own salvation in his hand. The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. With a snarl of disgust at his own weakness, he lowered the match. He placed it carefully back in the tin box, the small click of the lid a sound of profound defeat. He stalked to the door, his boots squelching in the kerosene. The fumes now smelled not of release, but of a chore postponed. He wrenched the heavy plank door open. The wind screamed into the cabin, guttering the lantern flame, threatening to plunge the room into darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing but a swirling vortex of snow and blackness. Then he looked down. It was a girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, a bundle of wet rags and shivering limbs huddled on his stoop. Her face was pale as bone, lips tinted a dark, bruised blue. Snow clung to her tangled hair and melted on her feverish skin. Her eyes, huge and dark in her small face, were fixed on him, not with fear, but with a terrifying, vacant exhaustion. As he watched, her gaze lost its focus. She swayed. Then a shudder racked her small frame. She coughed again, a terrible, gut-wrenching sound. This time, he saw it, a spray of dark crimson against the pristine white snow at her feet. Blood. Before he could process the sight, her knees buckled. She crumpled forward, a puppet with its strings cut, and collapsed across his threshold, her small body landing with a soft thud on the kerosene-soaked floorboards. For a long moment, Tarn just stood there, the wind whipping past him into the room, the girl a broken thing at his feet. The world had not granted him the clean end he craved. It had, instead, delivered a dying child to his door. He looked from her still form to the dark, waiting forest, then back to the lantern-lit cabin, its floor slick with the promise he couldn't keep. The match in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He hadn't chosen to live. He had simply been interrupted. Cursing the child, cursing the storm, cursing the God he no longer believed in, he bent down, his calloused hands reaching for the shivering girl not out of kindness, not out of compassion, but out of the brute, damnable instinct of a man who, despite everything, still knew the shape of a life worth saving, even if it wasn't his own. He lifted her with a grunt. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile collection of bones and fever. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm's fury. The latch clicked home, sealing them in together, the living and the dying, in a room that smelled of death postponed. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only dry surface in the cabin, the kerosene slick still inches away from its legs. Her head lolled to one side, her breathing a shallow, rattling whisper. The front of her thin tunic was dark and wet where she had coughed. He touched her forehead. It was burning. He stood over her, a giant, useless man in a room saturated with his own despair. The plan was gone, shattered by 3 soft knocks. He looked at the girl, then at the kerosene-soaked floor. The air was thick with flammable promises. He could still do it. He could lay her outside, back in the snow where he found her, and strike the match. The thought was a serpent coiling in his gut. A monstrous, logical, and utterly impossible idea. He was haunted by the ghosts of men he had killed, men who had been armed and dangerous. He wasn't sure he could survive being haunted by the ghost of a child he had abandoned. With a sigh that seemed to pull up the dregs of his soul, he walked to the hearth. Not for the match, but for the kindling. He scraped it together, his movements stiff and unfamiliar. It had been weeks since he'd bothered with a fire for warmth. He struck a different match, the flare of its head seeming to mock the grander fire he had denied himself. The flame caught the dry twigs, and a small, tentative light began to push back against the gloom and the smell of kerosene. He worked on instinct, the muscle memory of 100 other emergencies taking over. He found a relatively clean rag and a bucket, which he filled with snow from just outside the door. He melted it by the growing fire, then dipped the rag in the lukewarm water and began to gently clean the blood from the child's mouth and chin. Her skin was translucent, the blue veins a delicate map beneath the surface. She didn't stir. He stripped off her wet, flimsy clothes. They were little more than patched tatters, offering no protection from the wind. Underneath, she was shockingly thin, her ribs a stark cage beneath her skin. There were bruises on her arms and shins, old and new, faded yellows and angry purples. He wrapped her in his driest, thickest wool blanket, tucking it tightly around her small frame. The cough came again, even in her unconscious state, a deep, productive sound that shook her entire body. He turned her on her side, just as he had done for a man in his unit who'd been shot in the lung. A thick, dark fluid trickled from her lips onto the blanket. He wiped it away, his face a mask of grim focus. This was not a simple winter fever. This was deep. This was in her lungs. This was the kind of sickness that took root and didn't let go. He spent the next hour tending to her. He brewed a weak tea from the last of his willow bark, a bitter concoction for fever. He tried to coax a few drops between her lips, but most of it dribbled down her chin. He sat by the fire, keeping watch, the single lantern and the dancing flames casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The cabin felt different now. It was no longer a tomb awaiting consecration. It was a sick room. The air, still heavy with the scent of kerosene, now mingled with the smells of wet wool, sickness, and burning pine. The storm raged outside, a relentless assault on his small fortress, but the greater storm was inside him. A maelstrom of resentment, confusion, and a flicker of something he refused to name. He was a man who had meticulously planned his exit from the world, only to have the world, in the form of a half-dead child, walk right back in. He didn't want her here. He didn't want this responsibility. He had emptied himself of all capacity for care, and yet his hands knew what to do. They cleaned, they soothed, they tended. His body remembered a duty his mind had renounced. Sometime before dawn, the fever seemed to break. The fire in her skin cooled slightly, and a sheen of sweat beaded on her forehead. Her breathing, though still shallow, lost some of its ragged edge. She stirred in her sleep, her small hand twitching, fingers curling around the edge of the rough blanket. And then she spoke. Or rather, she sang. It was a murmur at first, a string of broken notes, barely audible above the dying wind. The words were in the old tongue, the one from the valleys over the eastern ridge, a dialect he hadn't heard in 20 years, not since the war. He leaned closer, his brow furrowed. It wasn't a child's nursery rhyme, it was a lullaby, but a strange one, a song of mourning. Sirotna ptitsa, leti, leti. Her voice was a wisp of sound, fragile as a spider's thread. Ne placi za gniezdo pod strehi. Tarn felt a cold dread snake up his spine. He knew that song. He had heard it hummed by weeping women as they searched for their dead on the bloody fields of Volkov Pass. It was a lament for a lost child, a song sung to the spirits of the unborn or the newly departed. Why would a child sing such a thing? Who had taught it to her? Tvoyat dom ev nebeto, visoko. She trailed off, her breathing deepening into a more stable sleep. Tarn sat back on his stool, the wooden legs creaking in the sudden silence. The fire crackled, spitting a spark onto the hearth. He stared at the girl, at her peaceful, pale face. She was a puzzle dropped into the middle of his apocalypse. She coughed blood, wore the bruises of a hard life, and sang the dirges of grieving mothers. He got up and walked to the door, cracking it open. The wind had lessened, and the snow was tapering off. The pre-dawn sky was a canvas of bruised purple and gray. The world was still there, cold, harsh, and unforgiving. He had tried to leave it, but it had pulled him back, tethering him with the frailest of threads, a sick child's breath. He looked at the floorboards, at the dark stains where the kerosene had soaked in. The smell was a constant reminder of his failed escape. The fire he had meant to purify his world had been reduced to a small flame keeping a stranger warm. He felt a surge of bitter anger. He was trapped, not by the storm, not by the cabin, but by this small, dying girl and the song she sang. He didn't know who she was or where she came from. He only knew that she had knocked on the door of a dead man and for now forced him to be alive. He closed the door, the latch clicking with a sound of grim finality. The day was coming, and he would have to face it. Days bled into a week. The girl, whom he learned was named Anka, hovered in the twilight between life and death. Her consciousness was a flickering candle, present one moment, gone the next. The fever was a relentless tide, ebbing and flowing, each retreat leaving her a little more diminished, a little more fragile. The cough remained her constant, terrible companion, a wet, tearing sound that echoed in the small cabin and often left new, bright spatters of blood on the rags he kept pressed to her lips. He fell into a rhythm dictated by her illness. Mornings were for gathering. He would venture out into the stark, white world, his rifle slung over his shoulder more out of habit than necessity. He checked his snares, bringing back scrawny rabbits that he would stew into a thin, watery broth. He dug under the snow for roots, burdock and chicory, boiling them down into bitter medicines that he wasn't sure did any good. He spent hours gathering firewood, his axe ringing out in the silent forest, the physical exertion a welcome distraction from the suffocating quiet of the sick room. Afternoons were for tending. He would sit by her cot, changing her dressings, wiping her brow, trying to spoon broth or tea between her pale lips. She rarely swallowed more than a few drops. He became an expert in the geography of her sickness, the precise shade of blue on her lips that signaled a struggle for breath, the specific rattle in her chest that preceded a coughing fit, the faint, sweetish odor of her sweat when the fever was at its peak. He did it all with a detached, grim efficiency. He told himself it was a problem to be solved, a machine to be fixed. He refused to let it be personal. He refused to feel. But the nights were the hardest. The nights were when she sang. She never spoke a coherent word to him when she was awake, her eyes wide and vacant. But in her fever dreams, she would murmur the haunting melodies of the old country. They were always songs of loss, of journeys with no return, of mothers watching sons march away to war. Songs he recognized with a sickening jolt of memory. He'd heard them whispered in makeshift field hospitals, hummed by prisoners awaiting execution. They were the soundtrack to his own damnation, and here they were, spilling from the lips of a child who couldn't possibly understand their meaning. One night, as a new storm howled outside, she began to sing a particular tune, a lullaby about a boatman ferrying a soul across a river of stars. Lod Karyu, Grebi Burzo, Dushata mi chaka na brega. Tarn froze, the cup of willow bark tea trembling in his hand. He knew that tune intimately. A lifetime ago, in a muddy trench during the siege of Krivadal, a young soldier next to him, a boy named Lubin with his guts shot out, had hummed that same song as he died. Lubin had said his mother sang it to him when he was a child, to ward off nightmares. Hearing it now, in this child's wispy voice, felt like a violation. It was as if she had reached into his memory and pulled out his most private horror. He stood up, his stool scraping harshly against the floor. "Where did you hear that?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. Anka's eyes were closed, her face serene in the firelight. She didn't respond, her singing trailing off into a soft sigh. He stared at her, a cold suspicion beginning to bloom in the back of his mind. This was too specific. The songs, the timing of her arrival, it felt less like coincidence and more like a carefully constructed torment. Was this some kind of fever-induced mimicry? Had she overheard soldiers somewhere? It made no sense. His cures were failing. The rabbit broth wasn't putting any flesh on her bones. The herbal teas cooled her fever for an hour at most before it raged back. The lung rot, or whatever it was winning. He was a trapper, a hunter, a soldier, not a healer. He had exhausted his meager knowledge. He needed herbs he didn't have, medicines he couldn't procure without a 3-day trek to the nearest settlement, a place he hadn't visited in years and had no desire to see again. The thought of the journey filled him with a weary dread. It meant leaving the isolation he had so carefully cultivated. It meant facing people, their questions, their pitying stares, and it meant leaving her alone. What if she died while he was gone? The thought should have brought relief. It would be an end to this bizarre purgatory. He could get back to his own end. But when he looked at her, so small and still in his oversized cot, a different feeling, stubborn and unwelcome, took root. It was the soldier's creed. You don't abandon your post. She was his post now. Damnable, unwanted, but his. He made the decision in the cold light of morning, looking at a fresh fleck of blood on her lips, brighter and more vivid than before. He had to go. He spent the day preparing. He chopped a mountain of firewood and stacked it inside near the hearth. He filled every container he had with fresh water from the creek. He cooked all the remaining rabbit meat, leaving it where she could potentially reach it. A futile hope. He checked the chinking in the walls, plugging any new cracks against the wind. He was securing the post before his departure. When he was ready to leave, he stood over her for a long moment. She was asleep, her breathing so shallow he had to place a hand over her mouth to feel the faint puff of air. "You are not to die while I'm gone," he said to her unconscious form, his voice rough. It was an order, not a plea. He wrapped her more securely in the blankets, then turned and left, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The journey was brutal. The snow was deep, the wind relentless. He pushed himself mercilessly, fueled by a grim determination that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with duty. The world was a blinding expanse of white and gray. He didn't stop to rest, chewing on strips of dried venison as he walked, his snowshoes making a steady, rhythmic crunch. He was a machine, built for endurance. He reached the settlement of Obreton on the evening of the second day. It was a squalid collection of huts huddled around a trading post and a grimy tavern, smelling of wood smoke, cheap spirits and desperation. The faces he saw were gaunt and suspicious. The war and the blight that followed had scraped the humanity off these people, leaving behind a hard, grasping core. He went straight to the apothecary, a stooped old woman named Zoraya, with eyes like chips of obsidian. He remembered her from before. She was said to traffic in cures for both the body and the soul. Her shop was a cramped, dark space cluttered with drying herbs, strange tinctures in dusty bottles, and the cloying smell of incense and decay. "I need a remedy for a lung sickness," he said without preamble. "A child. She coughs blood." Zoraya looked up from the mortar and pestle she was using, her eyes lingering on his haggard face, his wild beard, his worn clothes. She recognized him. Tarn Dorell, the man who had gone up the mountain after his wife died and never came back down. The local ghost story. "The bleeding cough," she said, her voice dry as dead leaves. "It has taken many this winter. There is no cure for it, only comforts for the dying." "There has to be something," Tarn insisted, his voice tight. "An herb, a poultice, anything." Zoraya stared at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her dark eyes. "There are old remedies, things the doctors in the city laugh at. They are expensive, and they rarely work." "I have pelts," he said, gesturing to the bundle on his back. Prime winter ermine and fox, his entire season's work, which he had planned to leave to burn in the cabin. She considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "There is a root. Krovitz root. It grows only on the highest, most dangerous cliffs, where the wind sings. It is said to seal the bleeding within the lungs, and a poultice of marshmallow and comfrey to draw the fire out." She named her price. It was everything he had, every last pelt. He didn't hesitate. He untied the bundle and threw it on the counter. The soft, white furs cascaded onto the dusty wood, a fortune in this impoverished place. Zoraya's eyes widened slightly. She gathered the ingredients, her movements slow and deliberate, wrapping them in waxed paper and placing them in a leather pouch. As she handed it to him, her gnarled fingers brushed his. Her skin was cold as stone. "You were a soldier, weren't you, Dorell?" she asked, her voice low. He just stared at her. "I heard stories," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "Volkov Pass, Krivadol. You saw things that follow a man." She paused. "Tell me, soldier, this child who coughs blood, does she sing?" A chill, colder than the mountain wind, went down Tarn's spine. He felt the hair on his arms stand up. "How do you know that?" Zoraya smiled, a faint, unsettling curl of her lips. "Because they always do. The ones who are sent." "Sent? What are you talking about? Who sent her?" he demanded, his hand gripping the pouch so tightly his knuckles were white. "Not who," the old woman whispered, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "What? Did you think you were the only one haunted on that mountain, Tarn Dorell? The old woods are full of sorrow. Sometimes, when a man's grief is so great, it poisons the ground he walks on, when he calls out for an end so loudly that the trees themselves tremble. The woods listen, the sorrow takes root, and it sends a messenger." He stared at her, his mind reeling. This was madness, the ramblings of a superstitious old crone. "The child is not sick by accident," Zoraya said, her voice hypnotic. "The sickness is the message. The songs are the key. She was drawn to your fire, Dorell, not the one in your hearth. The one you were about to light." She tapped a long, yellowed nail on the counter. "She is a vessel, carrying a grief as deep as your own. She was sent to you, not to be saved." "Then why?" Tarn's voice was a choked whisper. Zoraya's smile faded. Her expression became one of ancient, weary pity. "She was sent so you would have a choice. Her cure is not in this pouch. The Krovitz root might soothe her lungs, but it will not heal her. Nothing will. because she is not meant to live. She leaned in even closer, her breath smelling of dust and dried herbs. She is meant to be a mirror, and she will keep dying on your floor until you finally choose not to die alongside her. Tarn snatched the pouch from the counter. He turned without another word and strode out of the shop, the old woman's quiet, chilling laughter following him into the bleak twilight. He didn't go to the tavern. He didn't seek a bed. He turned and began the long trek back up the mountain, the apothecary's words echoing in his head, a venomous litany, madness, superstition, lies. But as he pushed his way through the deepening snow, under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars, he couldn't shake the image of Anka's face. He couldn't unhear her songs. And he couldn't ignore the terrifying, resonant truth in Zoraya's words. The child had knocked on his door at the exact moment he had surrendered to his own grief. She was a mirror, and what he saw in her was the reflection of his own desire for death. The journey back was a frantic race against time, but he no longer knew what he was racing against. Was it the sickness in her lungs, or the terrible purpose for which she had been sent? He made it back in a day and a half, fueled by a desperate, fearful energy. He burst into the cabin, his heart pounding with a dread he hadn't felt since the war. The fire was little more than glowing embers. The room was cold, still, and silent. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was too late. He rushed to the cot. Anka was there, under the pile of blankets. So still she seemed to have stopped breathing altogether. He pressed his fingers to her neck. He couldn't find a pulse. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He had failed. Zoraya was right. She was gone. Then a tiny, almost imperceptible flutter against his fingertips. A heartbeat. Faint, thready, but there. And as if his touch had roused her from the depths, her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes, usually vacant or clouded with fever, were clear. They focused on him, really saw him. "Tarn," she whispered. Her voice was weak, a dry rustle of leaves, but it was her own. It was the first time she had said his name. He stared at her, speechless. He had never told her his name. He set to work immediately, his hands trembling slightly as he ground the Krovitz root and brewed it into a dark, earthy tea. He prepared the poultice, the warm, damp mixture of herbs smelling of fresh earth and riverbanks. He lifted her gently, propping her against his chest, and helped her drink the tea. This time, she swallowed. She drank the whole cup, her eyes never leaving his face. He applied the warm poultice to her chest, the heat seeming to sink into her small body, a stark contrast to the deathly chill of her skin. He laid her back down and covered her, then built the fire back up until it blazed, filling the small cabin with warmth and a flickering, hopeful light. He sat on the stool beside her, exhausted, his body aching from the journey, his mind a chaotic whirl of Zoraya's cryptic pronouncements and the undeniable fact of the child's lucid gaze. For 2 days, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. The new medicines seemed to work a small miracle. The bleeding stopped. The cough subsided into a less violent rasp. The fever receded, leaving her pale and weak, but present. She was awake more than she was asleep. She watched him with her large, dark eyes as he moved about the cabin, her gaze following him with a quiet, unnerving intensity. She still didn't speak much, only whispering his name when she needed water, or shifting slightly to indicate discomfort. The song stopped. The silence they left behind was somehow more unnerving than the ghostly melodies. Without the fever dreams, she was just a child. A very sick, very quiet child. And Tarn found himself adrift. His purpose had been clear: fight the sickness. But now, with the sickness in retreat, a new and more terrifying question emerged. What now? He tried to talk to her, his voice rusty from disuse. "Where are you from, Anka? Who are your people? How did you find this cabin?" She would only look at him, her expression unreadable. Sometimes she would shake her head slightly, a gesture of negation that could have meant anything. I don't know. I can't say. It doesn't matter. He cleaned the cabin. Driven by a restless energy, he scrubbed the floorboards, trying to erase the dark stains and the lingering smell of kerosene. The act felt symbolic, an attempt to wash away his own dark intentions. But the wood had been soaked too deeply. The scent remained, a faint, acrid reminder of the man he had been just a few weeks ago. The man who poured prayer from a kerosene can. He started to notice things about her. The way her hands, though small and weak, were calloused on the pads of her fingers, like someone who played a stringed instrument. The way she would sometimes trace patterns on the blanket with her forefinger, patterns that looked like knots or complex weaves. And the way she watched the fire, not with a child's fascination, but with a deep, knowing stillness, as if she understood its dual nature of warmth and destruction. One afternoon, as he was sharpening his skinning knife by the hearth, she spoke, her voice clear and soft in the quiet room. My mother had a knife like that. Tarn paused, the whetstone hissing against the steel. He looked at her. She was propped up on one elbow, watching him. Did she? He asked, his voice neutral. She used it to cut the threads, Anka said. Her gaze was distant, as if looking at a memory. When a story was finished, she would cut the thread from the loom, so it wouldn't unravel. Threads, looms, stories. The words felt heavy with meaning he couldn't grasp. Was your mother a weaver? Anka shook her head. She was a singer of endings. When someone's time was done, she would go to them. She would sing their story from the first breath to the last. And when the song was over, their soul would be free to travel. She looked at him directly, her eyes ancient and wise in her child's face. She said every life is a song. Some are short, some are long, some are joyful, some are full of sorrow, but they all must have an end. Tarn put the knife and stone down. Zoraya's words came rushing back. She is a vessel. The songs are the key. And the lullabies you sing? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Were they her songs? They are the travel songs, Anka said simply, for the journey after the thread is cut. She lay back down, as if the effort of speaking had exhausted her. She closed her eyes. Tarn sat in stunned silence. A singer of endings, a weaver of stories. This wasn't a child's fantasy. It was a mythology, ancient and deeply ingrained. He was living in a folk tale he didn't believe in. The girl wasn't just a sick child. She was the daughter of... What? A psychopomp? A village shaman who eased the passing of the dying? He looked around the cabin, at the objects he had anointed for destruction. Alara's photograph, the wingless bird, the armchair. They were not just things. They were verses in his own song of sorrow. A song he had tried to end abruptly, with fire. He had gathered every memory into this single shack, then lit a match. Or tried to. And she had appeared, a singer of endings, to what? Stop him, or to officiate. The fragile peace shattered 3 days later. He woke to the sound of the cough, worse than ever before, a violent body-racking spasm that left her breathless and limp. He rushed to her side. The front of her tunic was soaked in fresh, bright blood. The crovet's root had failed, the poultice was useless, the sickness was back, with a vengeance. It hadn't been defeated, it had only been resting. Zoraya's voice echoed in his mind. Her cure is not in this pouch. She is not meant to live. The next days were a waking nightmare, a descent back into the hell he thought they had escaped. The fever returned, hotter than before, making her delirious, and the songs came back. But they were different now. They weren't just the sad lullabies of loss. They were his songs. In her fever dream, she sang of a young man leaving his mountain village, promising his new bride he'd return a hero. She sang of the mud and terror of a battlefield he had tried for 20 years to forget. She hummed the tune of a marching song his unit had sung, a bawdy, foolish thing that turned into a scream in her throat. She whispered the name of his commanding officer, a man he had seen cut in half by cannon fire. She sang of a long, cold winter, of a woman's belly swelling with child, and then of the shallow, frozen grave he had dug with his own hands. She was singing the story of his life, his grief, his failure. He knelt by her cot, his hands clenched into fists, listening to his own history being unspooled from the mouth of a dying child. It was an interrogation, a confession forced from him by proxy. Every forgotten detail, every buried shame, every drop of blood on his hands was being brought into the firelight and given a melody. "Stop it," he begged her one night, as she murmured the lullaby Ilara had planned to sing to their son, a song he thought only he remembered. "Please, Anka, stop." Her eyes opened, but they were glazed with fever. They looked through him. "The song isn't finished," she rasped, a bloody froth on her lips. "The thread is not yet cut." He understood then. With a terrifying, soul-crushing certainty, he understood. Zoraya was right. The apothecary, the crone, the purveyor of folk tales, had spoken the absolute truth. Anka was not here to be saved by him. She was the physical embodiment of his own will to die, a choice he had made on that stormy night. She was his grief made flesh, and she would continue to suffer and die as long as he clung to his own ending. Her sickness was his suicide, drawn out in agonizing detail. He looked at her, at this child who was carrying the weight of his entire miserable life in her tiny, failing body. He saw the pain in her eyes, the struggle for every breath, and he realized he was the source of her torment. His desire for oblivion was suffocating her. She will keep dying on your floor until you finally choose not to die alongside her. The choice. It had always been the choice. He had thought the choice was to strike the match or not, but that wasn't it. The choice was not about his own death. It was about his own life, to actively choose it, to turn away from the ghosts and the grief and the kerosene-soaked floor and choose to live. Not just to exist, not just to survive, but to live. It was the hardest thing he had ever faced, harder than any battle, harder than any winter, harder than digging his wife's grave. To let go of the grief that had defined him for so long felt like a betrayal. To choose life felt like a mockery of her death, of their sons. His sorrow was all he had left of them. It was his monument, his penance. He looked at Anka. Her breathing was a thread of sound about to snap. He saw the bruises on her arms, the hollows of her cheeks, the blood on her lips. This was his monument. This was his penance. A dying child, a tortured soul reflecting his own. His choice wasn't about him anymore. It was about her. He could not let her suffer this for his sake. He could not be her executioner. He stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if waking from a long, terrible sleep. He walked to the back wall, to the small, warped photograph of Ilara. He looked at her faded smile. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I have to let you go." He gently pulled the photograph from the chinking. He held it for a moment, then carried it to the fire. He hesitated, his hand trembling. Then he tossed it into the flames. He watched the paper curl, the image of his wife blacken and turn to ash, disappearing into the heat. It was an agony, and a release. He went to the mantelpiece and picked up the small, wingless bird he had carved for his son. He held the smooth wood in his palm, the weight of it both a comfort and a pain. He had clung to it for 2 decades. He kissed the wood, a final goodbye to the boy he never knew, and he threw it into the fire as well. One by one, he gathered the artifacts of his sorrow, the armchair, the untouched books, his old uniform folded away in a chest. He couldn't burn them all, not now, not in the cabin. But in his heart, he placed them on the pyre. He renounced his claim to them. He cut the threads. He knelt by the hearth, the fire warming his face. He closed his eyes. He didn't pray to any god. He spoke into the silence of his own soul. I choose to live. The words were unspoken, but they were the loudest sound he had ever made. He wasn't sure what it meant, or what he would do tomorrow, or the day after. He only knew that he had to cut the song of sorrow short. He had to write a new verse. He felt a change in the room, a stillness. The air seemed lighter. He opened his eyes and turned. Anka was sitting up in the cot. The fever was gone from her eyes. The bruised, bluish tint was gone from her lips. She was breathing, deeply, evenly. The terrible wet rattle in her chest was gone. She looked pale, exhausted, but whole, healed. She looked at him, and for the first time she smiled. A small, weak but genuine smile. The story can have a new ending now, she said, her voice clear as a spring thaw. Tarn stared at her, tears finally tracking paths through the grime on his cheeks. He had not saved her with herbs or medicine. He had saved her by saving himself. The price of pausing his own death was not just her survival, it was his own. The crackle of wood soaked in regret had been silenced, replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of two beating hearts in a small cabin on a lonely mountain. He walked over to her and sat on the edge of the cot. He reached out and took her small, frail hand. It was warm. He looked around the room. It was no longer a tomb. It was just a room. The smell of kerosene was still there, faint, a ghost of a ghost, a reminder of the choice he had made. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, a promise not of an ending, but of a morning to come. The final moment had arrived, and it was not the searing blaze of self-immolation he had planned. It was this, quiet, earned, and somehow inevitable. He held the child's hand, and for the first time in 20 years, Tarn Doral felt the simple, terrifying, and profound weight of a reason to see the sunrise.